In a quiet, modest neighborhood, 12-year-old Jonah Parker lives a life built on hard work and simple dreams. With his family facing their own struggles, Jonah saves every penny he earns, hoping to buy a second-hand bicycle, a small goal that feels like everything to him. But one brisk autumn afternoon, Jonah's path takes an unexpected turn when he encounters a woman in need at a bus stop with a heart bigger than his pockets. Jonah makes a choice that will ripple far beyond anything he could have imagined. That single moment, crumpled bills offered in silence, sets off a chain of events that changes not only Jonah's life, but the lives of those around him. As kindness flows in unexpected ways, Jonah's quiet actions will lead to moments of hardship, surprising generosity, and lessons he never knew he needed. Through the struggles of a cold winter, the unwavering support of his family, and the kindness of neighbors who notice his efforts, Jonah learns that even the smallest gestures can carry incredible weight. But where will this journey take him? What difference can a young boy truly make? And how does one simple act of compassion transform into something extraordinary? The air carried the chill of early autumn, crisp and edged with the promise of winter. The leaves in Jonah Parker's small neighborhood crunched beneath his worn sneakers as he walked home from school. His neighborhood was one of modest houses with peeling paint and yards, just tidy enough to pass notice. It was a quiet corner of the world, where neighbors greeted each other with nods and smiles that spoke of shared struggles and unspoken understanding. Jonah was 12 years old and the kind of boy people described as quiet but polite. He was a small kid for his age, all elbows and knees, with brown eyes that seemed a little too serious for someone so young. Jonah's family did not have much, but they made do. His father, Marcus Parker, worked long hours at the factory, and his mother, Sarah Parker, earned extra money sewing clothes for people in town. Their house was small but clean, with patches of mismatched wallpaper in the kitchen and a living room where the couch had started to sag. Jonah shared a room with his younger brother Noah, who was only 6 and often snored loudly in his sleep. Jonah had learned to tune it out. Life was not easy, but Jonah never felt resentful. His parents worked hard, and they were a family that stuck together no matter what. That day, as Jonah trudged home with his school bag weighing down one shoulder, he felt unusually light-hearted. For weeks, he had been saving his allowance and the small amounts he earned from mowing lawns. He had his eye on a second-hand bicycle at the local thrift store. It was scratched and missing a bell, but to Jonah, it was perfect. The thought of riding it down the hill near the park filled him with anticipation. He was only a few dollars short now. As he turned the corner near the bus stop, Jonah slowed. There, sitting alone on a weathered bench, was a woman. Her dark hair fell in messy waves over her face, and her thin coat looked far too worn for the biting breeze. Jonah noticed her hands resting gently over her stomach, which was round and heavy, signaling that she was expecting a baby. Something about the woman's posture, a mixture of exhaustion and quiet despair, made him stop. Jonah hesitated. He could have walked on. It was not his business, and most people would not have given her a second glance. But Jonah's feet seemed glued to the pavement. He took a tentative step closer. "Ma'am, are you okay?" His voice was soft but clear. The woman looked up, startled. Her face was pale, and her eyes were red and swollen, as though she had been crying for hours. She forced a smile, but it faltered quickly. "I'm fine, thank you." Her voice was small and thin, barely more than a whisper. Jonah frowned. He did not believe her. She looked anything but fine. "Are you sure?" he pressed gently. "You don't look fine." The woman's shoulders slumped. For a moment, she stared at her hands as though weighing whether to speak. Finally, she sighed, the sound heavy with defeat. "I'm trying to get home," she admitted. "I need to take the bus, but I don't have enough money. I have been walking all day, and I'm so tired." Jonah's chest tightened. He thought about the money in his pocket, the handful of crumpled bills and coins that made up his savings. He had been so close to buying that bike. Yet, as he looked at the woman before him, her trembling hands clutching the thin fabric of her coat, Jonah knew he could not walk away. He took a deep breath. "Hold on a minute." Jonah dug into his pocket, pulling out every bill and coin he had. The sight of it made his heart clench. He had spent months saving that money, $1 at a time. But in this moment, it did not feel like a choice. He stepped forward, holding it out to her. "Here, this should be enough for the bus fare." The woman stared at the money, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I can't take your money," she said quickly, shaking her head. "You're just a kid. You probably need it." Jonah shrugged, trying to smile even as his stomach turned. "It's okay," he said. "You need it more than I do." For a long moment she did not move. Then, with shaking hands, she reached out and accepted the money. Tears filled her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she wiped them away with her sleeve. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't know how much this means to me. Thank you." Jonah felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, soft and light. "It's no problem," he said softly. "Just take care of yourself, okay?" The woman nodded, clutching the money as though it were the most precious thing in the world. A few minutes later, the bus pulled up to the stop with a hiss of brakes. Jonah stayed by the bench, watching as she boarded. She turned to the window, meeting his gaze one last time. Her face was still streaked with tears, but her smile was genuine now. She waved at him through the glass. Jonah waved back, his heart full, as the bus disappeared down the road. The walk home felt different than before, lighter somehow, as though he had shed a weight he did not know he carried. He no longer had enough for the bike, and the thought made him ache a little, but he pushed it aside. He had done the right thing, and that was what mattered. When Jonah arrived home, the smell of his mother's cooking filled the small kitchen. She glanced over her shoulder as he came in, her brow furrowing slightly. "You're late, Jonah. Everything okay?" "Yeah, Mom. Everything's fine." Jonah set down his bag and smiled faintly. His father, Marcus, was sitting at the table, reading the newspaper with weary eyes. "You sure? You look like you've been thinking too hard." Jonah shrugged. "Just helping someone out," he said simply. He did not feel the need to explain. It felt like something that did not need words. "Good man," Marcus said with a nod, turning back to his paper. That night, Jonah lay awake in the bottom bunk, listening to the soft hum of the heater and the rhythmic snoring of his brother above him. He thought about the woman at the bus stop. Had she made it home safely? Did she have someone waiting for her? Was she warm and safe now, wherever she was? A part of him wanted answers, but he knew he might never see her again. All he could hope was that she was okay. As he drifted to sleep, Jonah felt a quiet sense of fulfillment settle over him. It was not the kind of satisfaction he would have felt from riding that second-hand bike down the hill at the park. It was something deeper, something he could not quite put into words. He did not know it then, but that small moment, those crumpled bills and quiet words, would set in motion something much larger than he could ever have imagined. The next morning, as Jonah picked up his backpack and prepared for another day at school, he glanced out the window. The autumn leaves fluttered gently to the ground, and the sun peeked through gray clouds. It looked like any other day, but Jonah could not shake the feeling that something had shifted. Kindness, he thought, was like a ripple in a pond. It started small, barely noticeable, but it grew, spreading farther and farther until it touched places you could not see. And Jonah had just tossed the first stone. The next day passed like any other. Jonah sat at his usual desk in the back row, doodling absent-mindedly in the margins of his notebook as the teacher explained fractions on the chalkboard. His mind kept drifting to the woman at the bus stop. He wondered where she was now, if she had made it home, if someone was there to welcome her. When the final bell rang, Jonah grabbed his backpack and hurried out the door. He did not linger with the other kids. Instead, he went straight to his lawn mowing job. Jonah worked for several neighbors who were too busy or too old to handle their yards. This afternoon, he started with Mrs. Finch's house. Her yard was always neat, but the autumn leaves had fallen in waves overnight, blanketing the grass in orange and gold. Jonah liked Mrs. Finch. She was an older woman with silver hair and a kind face. Everyone in the neighborhood knew she made the best chocolate chip cookies. "Back again, Jonah?" Mrs. Finch called from her porch as he pushed the old mower toward the yard. "Yes, ma'am. I'll have this cleaned up in no time." Jonah smiled faintly and got to work. The wind tugged at his sleeves as he pushed the mower over the scattered leaves. He worked methodically, watching as the mower sucked up the bright colors and left tidy rows of green in its wake. When he finished, he gathered the remaining leaves into piles and raked them into bags. By the time he was done, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, and the evening chill had begun to settle in. Jonah wiped the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his worn jacket and hauled the last bag to the curb. Mrs. Finch came outside just as he finished, carrying something in her hands. "You did a wonderful job, Jonah," she said, her voice warm. She held out a small envelope. "Here's your pay, and I added a little extra this time." Jonah blinked in surprise. He took the envelope and felt its weight. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch, but you don't have to do that." "I know I don't," Mrs. Finch said with a smile, "but I heard about what you did yesterday." Jonah's heart skipped a beat. "You did?" She nodded. "I was walking back from the market when I saw you with that woman at the bus stop. That was a kind thing you did, Jonah. Not everyone would have given up their hard-earned money to help a stranger." Jonah looked down at his shoes, his cheeks turning pink. "It wasn't a big deal," he mumbled. Mrs. Finch shook her head. "It was a very big deal. Kindness like that is rare, and it deserves to be noticed." She patted his shoulder and handed him a small brown bag. "Here, I baked some cookies this morning. I thought you might like them." Jonah smiled, his embarrassment fading slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch." He tucked the envelope into his backpack and carried the bag of cookies carefully as he made his way home. The sun had set by the time he turned onto his street, and the faint glow of the kitchen light spilled from the windows of his family's house. Inside, his mother was setting the table for dinner, and the familiar smells of chicken soup filled the small kitchen. His father sat at the table, reading the newspaper as usual, while Noah scribbled with crayons on the back of a paper grocery bag. "You're late again," his mother said as Jonah walked in. She glanced at the brown bag in his hand. "What's that?" "Cookies from Mrs. Finch," Jonah replied, setting the bag on the table. "She gave me a little extra today." His father looked up, lowering the newspaper. "Extra? What for?" Jonah hesitated, shrugging slightly. "She saw me help someone yesterday." His mother raised an eyebrow as she ladled soup into bowls. "Help someone?" Jonah sat down at the table, feeling his cheeks flush again. "There was this woman at the bus stop. She needed money to get home, so I gave her mine." His father's face softened, and he set the newspaper down completely. "Your allowance?" Jonah nodded. "Yeah." For a moment, the room was silent. Then his mother spoke, her voice quiet, but full of warmth. "Jonah, that was a kind thing to do." His father nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Not everyone would do that, son. I'm proud of you." Jonah felt a mix of emotions, pride, embarrassment, and something he could not quite name. He stared into his bowl of soup, stirring it slowly. "It wasn't that big of a deal," he said again, though the words felt hollow. His mother smiled faintly. "Kindness always comes back to us, Jonah. It might not seem like much now, but you never know what ripples you've set in motion." Jonah did not say anything, but her words stayed with him long after dinner. That night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft creaks of the old house and the quiet snoring of his brother. The events of the past 2 days played over and over in his mind: the woman at the bus stop, the tears in her eyes, the way she had waved at him through the window. Jonah wondered what she had done with the money. Did she make it home? Was she warm and safe now? Did she have someone to care for her? His thoughts turned to Mrs. Finch. Her praise had caught him off guard, but it had also made him feel something he had not expected: pride. Not the pride that came from earning money or winning a prize, but a quiet, steady feeling that came from doing something good even when no one was watching. Jonah rolled onto his side and stared at the faint outline of the window. The world outside was dark, but the stars twinkled faintly in the sky, distant but constant. Kindness always comes back, his mother had said. Jonah did not know if that was true, but for some reason, he hoped it was. The next morning, Jonah woke early. The world outside was cold and gray, with frost clinging to the edges of the windows. He dressed quickly, pulling on his jacket and slipping out the door before his family had even sat down for breakfast. Jonah wanted to see the bike at the thrift store again. He did not have the money to buy it anymore, but he could not stop himself from looking. It was as though seeing it might make him feel better, even if he knew it would still be there, waiting for someone else to claim it. The thrift store was small and cluttered, with shelves crammed full of old books, dishes, and clothes. The bike sat near the front window, just as Jonah remembered it. Its frame was scratched and dented, but the tires were solid, and the chain looked sturdy. Jonah ran his hand along the handlebars, imagining what it would feel like to ride it down the hill at the park, the wind whipping through his hair. "Back again, Jonah?" Jonah turned to see the store owner, Mr. Willis, standing behind the counter. He was an older man with thick glasses and a kind face. "Just looking," Jonah said quickly. Mr. Willis smiled faintly. "That bike's been waiting for you. It's not going anywhere." Jonah nodded, but his heart felt heavy. "Thanks, Mr. Willis." As he walked home, his breath puffing in the cold air, Jonah tried to shake the disappointment from his mind. He would start saving again. It might take a while, but he would get there eventually. When he turned onto his street, Jonah noticed someone standing on his front porch. It was a man in a dark suit, holding a leather briefcase. Jonah's stomach flipped. Visitors were rare at their house, especially ones who looked so formal. His mother opened the door just as Jonah reached the bottom of the steps. She looked puzzled, glancing between the man and Jonah. "Jonah, there's someone here to see you." Jonah stared at the man, his heart pounding. He had no idea who he was or why he was there. The man smiled warmly and extended a hand. "You must be Jonah Parker," he said. "It's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Daniel Whitaker." Jonah hesitated, shaking the man's hand. "Hi. I'm here," Daniel said, "on behalf of someone you helped recently." Jonah's brow furrowed. "Someone I helped?" Daniel nodded, his smile widening. "Yes, a woman you met at the bus stop." Jonah's heart skipped a beat. He could only stare as Daniel stepped inside, his briefcase in hand. "May I come in?" Jonah felt his pulse quicken as he followed his mother and the man, Daniel Whitaker, into the small living room. His father had just come in from the kitchen, a rag slung over his shoulder. Marcus Parker looked puzzled as he glanced between his wife and the stranger in the suit. "Who's this?" Marcus asked, his voice firm but polite. Daniel set his briefcase on the coffee table and extended his hand to Marcus. "My name is Daniel Whitaker. I'm here on behalf of someone your son helped recently." Jonah felt his cheeks flush under his father's sudden gaze. Marcus turned to him with a curious frown. "Jonah, you know this man?" Jonah shifted uncomfortably, the memory of the woman at the bus stop filling his mind. "Not exactly," Jonah muttered. I gave someone my money for the bus fare a couple of days ago. She needed help getting home." Marcus blinked, his expression softening slightly as he looked back at Daniel. "So this is about that?" Daniel nodded, his smile kind and reassuring. "Yes, sir. I'm here because Jonah's act of kindness didn't go unnoticed." Sarah Parker perched on the edge of the armrest, her brow furrowed with quiet concern. Is the woman okay? Did she get home safely? She did, Daniel assured her. He looked at Jonah, his gaze warm and steady. Her name is Emily Bennett. She was having an incredibly difficult time. She had lost her job, and without money or support, she'd spent hours walking, desperate to find her way back home. She told me that your son's kindness that day was the push she needed. Jonah gave her hope when she felt she had none. Jonah sat quietly on the edge of the couch, feeling small under the weight of everyone's attention. It had not felt like much at the time, just a small handful of crumpled bills, but hearing Daniel speak about it made him feel important in a way that was new and unfamiliar. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice quieter now. We're glad to hear she's okay, but you didn't have to come all this way to tell us. Daniel's smile widened as he unfastened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, white envelope. He placed it carefully on the coffee table in front of them. Emily shared her story with her family, and they were moved by what Jonah did for her. They wanted to express their gratitude in a meaningful way. This, he tapped the envelope, is a small gift to Jonah and your family. Jonah's eyes widened. His mother gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. His father stared at the envelope, blinking as though unsure he had heard correctly. What do you mean, a gift? Marcus asked carefully, his voice full of caution. Daniel nodded, his tone calm and understanding. Emily's family would like Jonah to have this. They hope it will help him build a brighter future. It's a token of their appreciation for what Jonah did that day. Jonah's father hesitated, his rough hands reaching for the envelope. He opened it carefully, and Jonah watched as his father's face shifted, his eyebrows rising in shock and his mouth parting slightly. Inside the envelope was a neat stack of bills. Jonah could see the edges of the money, crisp and perfectly lined. Marcus turned to Daniel, his voice hoarse. This is a lot of money. It's $5,000, Daniel said simply. Emily's family wanted to make sure Jonah knows how much his kindness mattered. The room fell silent. Jonah's mother wiped a tear from her cheek, and his father rubbed a hand over his face, clearly trying to gather his thoughts. Jonah could only sit frozen, his mind spinning. $5,000? He had never seen that much money before. To him, it was an impossible number, a dream beyond dreams. Sir, Marcus finally said, his voice steady, but filled with quiet emotion. We don't know what to say. Daniel stood, his smile warm and sincere. There's nothing you need to say. Jonah's actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Sometimes, the smallest kindness can ripple out in ways we can't imagine. He turned to Jonah and met his gaze directly. Never underestimate the impact of what you did that day, Jonah. You reminded a woman and her family that even when the world feels cold and hopeless, there are still good people willing to help. Jonah swallowed the lump rising in his throat. He did not know how to respond. He had not helped Emily for recognition or reward. He had just wanted to do the right thing. Now, sitting here in his family's small living room, it all felt surreal. Daniel picked up his briefcase and straightened his jacket. I'll leave you to discuss this as a family. If you have any questions or need to reach me, my contact information is on the card in the envelope. Marcus shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. Really, thank you. Daniel gave a small nod and turned toward the door. Just before he left, he paused to look back at Jonah. You're a good kid, Jonah. Keep being kind. The world needs more people like you. When the door finally closed behind him, the Parker family sat in stunned silence. Marcus held the envelope carefully, as though it might break if he handled it too roughly. Sarah finally broke the silence. Jonah, do you understand what just happened? Jonah nodded slowly. Kind of. He looked at his father, his voice soft. What are we going to do with the money? Marcus let out a long breath and set the envelope on the coffee table. It's not for spending on just anything, he said firmly. This is for your future, Jonah, for your education. We're going to make sure it's used the right way. Jonah nodded, his heart still racing. He did not need the money right now. He still had his bike to save for, but his father's words made him sit up a little straighter. Your kindness did this, Jonah, his mother said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. Her eyes shone with tears, but her smile was bright. You should be proud of yourself. Jonah smiled faintly, but pride was not exactly what he felt. It was more like awe, a deep, quiet feeling that something good had happened because of him. That night, after dinner, Jonah sat at his small desk in the corner of the shared bedroom. The notebook he used for schoolwork lay open in front of him, but he was not drawing or solving math problems. Instead, he stared at the blank page, thinking about Emily Bennett and the chain of events his small action had set in motion. His mother's words echoed in his head. Kindness always comes back to us. Jonah picked up his pencil and wrote 3 simple words at the top of the page. Be kind, always. For the first time, he truly understood what that meant. It was not about getting something in return. It was about making the world just a little better, even if no one noticed. When Jonah lay down to sleep that night, the world felt bigger and brighter than it ever had before. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the small window Jonah shared with his younger brother Noah. The familiar sounds of the house waking up surrounded him, his mother humming as she prepared breakfast, the muffled clink of dishes, and his father's voice softly rumbling from the kitchen as he spoke about work. Jonah sat up slowly, his mind still lingering on the events of the previous day. The envelope, the visitor, the $5,000, it all felt like a dream. But the expression on his father's face as he carefully tucked the envelope into the drawer of their small second-hand dresser had been very real. Jonah got dressed quietly and padded into the kitchen, where his mother was flipping pancakes on the stove. Noah sat at the table, his legs swinging beneath his chair as he drew shapes on a napkin with a crayon. Morning, Jonah, Sarah said over her shoulder. Pancakes are ready. Sit down and eat before they get cold. Morning, Mom, Jonah mumbled as he sat across from Noah. His father was at the far end of the table, sipping black coffee from his chipped mug. He looked up as Jonah settled in, studying him for a moment with a small, unreadable smile. You okay, son? Marcus asked. Jonah nodded, though something still sat heavy in his chest. Yeah, Dad, I'm fine. His father nodded back, though his eyes lingered on Jonah for just a moment longer. Good. You've got work to do this afternoon. Don't forget. Jonah knew what his father meant. Saturdays were lawn mowing days, his chance to earn a little money, 1 yard at a time. I won't forget, Jonah said between bites of his pancake. As he ate, his thoughts drifted to the bike. The image of it scratched, dented, but so perfect, hovered in his mind like a quiet ache. Before he had given his money to Emily, he had been just a few dollars short. Now, his small savings had been reduced to nothing, but somehow, it felt okay. Jonah remembered the look on Emily's face when she had boarded the bus and waved to him through the window, the way she had clutched the money as though it meant the world. That had been worth more than any bike. The afternoon sunlight warmed Jonah's back as he raked Mrs. Lee's yard later that day. Mrs. Lee was a widow who lived 3 houses down. Her lawn was always covered in leaves this time of year, and she often hired Jonah to help her clean it up. Mrs. Lee was not like Mrs. Finch. She rarely smiled, and always looked as though she carried some invisible weight on her shoulders. Her sharp voice often startled Jonah, but he still worked hard to keep her lawn neat and tidy. Make sure you get the leaves by the fence, she called from her porch, her voice clipped and stern. Yes, ma'am, Jonah called back, pushing the rake in even rows across the yard. As he worked, he thought about the money again, $5,000. He still did not quite understand it. It felt too big, too much, and yet his father had been right to tuck it away. That money was not for today. It was for something far ahead, like school or the future. When Jonah finally finished bagging the last pile of leaves, he carried the bags to the curb and wiped his hands on his jeans. Mrs. Lee came outside, her heavy coat wrapped tightly around her small frame. She held out a $5 bill, her bony fingers pinching the edge. "Here you go, boy. Good work." Jonah smiled faintly as he took the bill. "Thank you, Mrs. Lee." She lingered for a moment, studying him with narrowed eyes. "You're a quiet one, aren't you?" Jonah shrugged. "I guess so." Mrs. Lee nodded sharply, as though that confirmed something for her. Quiet is not always a bad thing. Too many people talk without saying much of anything. She paused, and for the briefest moment, Jonah thought he saw something kind in her eyes, a softness he had never noticed before. "Hard workers get far in life," she added, and then she turned and went back inside. Jonah stood there for a moment, holding the $5 bill in his hand. He glanced toward the thrift store down the road and felt the familiar tug of longing. He could ride there right now and see the bike again. But as he walked home, Jonah tucked the money into his pocket and thought about something else, what Mrs. Lee had said. Hard workers get far in life. He had heard his father say something similar before. Maybe there was truth to it. When Jonah got home, his mother was sitting at the kitchen table with her sewing supplies spread out in front of her. She was stitching a patch onto a pair of Noah's jeans, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jonah sat down across from her, the small $5 bill still warm in his pocket. "Did Mrs. Lee pay you?" his mother asked, without looking up. "Yes, ma'am," Jonah replied softly. Sarah paused her sewing, glancing up at Jonah with a curious look. "You've been working hard, Jonah. Your father and I see that, you know." Jonah felt his cheeks warm. "I just want to help." His mother smiled faintly, setting the jeans down. "You do more than you know, sweetheart." She reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "Every little bit counts." Jonah nodded, though he was not sure what to say. He knew his parents were proud of him, but something about her words made his chest ache in a good way. Later that evening, Jonah could not resist it anymore. He rode his old squeaky scooter to the thrift store, his breath misting in the cool evening air. The shop was quiet when he arrived, and Mr. Willis was tidying the shelves behind the counter. "Back again, Jonah?" Mr. Willis called with a knowing smile. Jonah grinned sheepishly. "Just looking." The bike sat in the front window, just as it always did. Jonah knelt beside it, running his hand gently along the handlebars. He could already imagine how it would feel to ride it, to fly down the hill near the park, the wind in his face, the world stretching out in front of him. "Still saving up, huh?" Mr. Willis asked, walking over. Jonah nodded. "I'm trying." Mr. Willis smiled thoughtfully. "That's a good thing, you know. Working for what you want makes it matter more when you finally get it." Jonah looked up at him. "Yeah, I know." The old man studied him for a moment, his eyes twinkling behind thick glasses. "Tell you what, Jonah, I'll hold this bike for you. You've got a good heart, and I think it belongs to you." Jonah's eyes widened. "You'll hold it? For me?" Mr. Willis nodded. "It's not going anywhere. Just keep working hard, and you'll get there." Jonah grinned, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Willis. I promise I'll save up." As Jonah rode his scooter home, he felt lighter than he had in days. The bike would wait for him, and he would work harder than ever to earn it. When he got back, the house was quiet, and the stars glittered brightly overhead. Jonah paused for a moment in the yard, staring up at the sky. He thought about the small acts of kindness that had shaped the last few days his own, and those of people like Mrs. Finch and Mr. Willis. Maybe that was how the world worked, he thought. People helped one another in small ways, planting seeds they might never see grow. Jonah smiled to himself as he headed inside. He still did not have the bike, but he would get there, and when he did, it would mean more than it ever could have before. The days settled into a familiar rhythm as October rolled on. The air grew colder, and the trees turned bare, their branches stark against the pale gray sky. Jonah spent his afternoons raking leaves, walking dogs, and mowing the last few stubborn patches of grass that hadn't yet succumbed to the frost. Every dollar he earned went straight into a small glass jar he kept on his desk. The jar sat in plain view, a constant reminder of his goal, the scratched-up bike waiting for him in Mr. Willis's thrift store window. Jonah would take the jar off the shelf every night, counting the coins and crumpled bills carefully. He was still far from his target, but each day brought him a little closer. He thought often of what Mr. Willis had said, "Working for what you want makes it matter more when you finally get it." Jonah believed that, and yet sometimes, when the wind bit at his cheeks as he worked outside, or when his legs ached from raking piles of wet leaves, he could not help but feel tired. On a particularly chilly Tuesday afternoon, Jonah stood in the school cafeteria with his lunch tray, scanning the crowded tables. Most of the kids clustered in loud, energetic groups, trading jokes and shouts across the room. Jonah usually sat alone, or sometimes with the quieter kids, content to eat his peanut butter sandwich and apple in peace. Today, however, something caught his attention. Across the cafeteria, a boy named Ethan sat alone at a corner table. Ethan was smaller than most of the other kids in their grade, with shaggy blonde hair and clothes that always looked a little too big for him. Jonah noticed Ethan poking at his tray, a small carton of milk and a single roll of bread. That was it. Jonah hesitated. He knew what it felt like to have little, but his parents always made sure he had enough. It did not sit right with him to see someone sitting there with so little to eat. After a moment, Jonah turned and walked toward Ethan's table. He set his tray down across from him and sat without a word. Ethan looked up in surprise, his eyes wide. "Hi," Jonah said simply, unwrapping his sandwich. Ethan gave a small, cautious nod. "Hi." Jonah glanced at Ethan's tray. "Is that all you're eating?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, I'm not really hungry." Jonah frowned. He had heard those words before, and he knew what they meant. His mother had once said that people sometimes said they weren't hungry when there just wasn't enough food to go around. Without thinking, Jonah broke his sandwich in half and held one piece out to Ethan. "Here, take this." Ethan's face turned red. "I can't. It's your lunch." "It's fine," Jonah said with a small smile. "I'm not that hungry." Ethan stared at the sandwich for a moment before finally taking it, his hands shaking slightly. "Thanks," he mumbled, looking down at the table. They ate in silence for a while. Jonah didn't press Ethan with questions. He knew enough about how it felt when someone noticed your struggles you didn't want to explain it. When lunch ended, Ethan glanced at Jonah as they stood to throw away their trays. "Hey, Jonah?" "Yeah?" Ethan shifted awkwardly, his voice quiet. "Thanks. For the sandwich, I mean." Jonah smiled faintly. "No problem." Ethan looked at him for another moment, his face softening. "You're a good guy, you know." Jonah blinked, surprised. He hadn't thought much about what he had done. It was just half a sandwich. But Ethan's words stayed with him as he walked to class, a warm glow settling quietly in his chest. That afternoon, Jonah was working in Mrs. Finch's yard, raking up another layer of fallen leaves. The wind tugged at his sleeves, and his breath misted in front of him. When he finally finished, Mrs. Finch came outside carrying a steaming mug of cocoa. "Here, Jonah," she said, handing it to him. "You look like you could use this." Jonah accepted the mug gratefully, his cold hands curling around the warmth. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch." She smiled as she looked out at her clean yard. "You always do such a good job, Jonah. You've got a strong work ethic for someone your age." Jonah took a sip of the cocoa, savoring the sweetness. "I just want to help," he said quietly. Mrs. Finch studied him for a moment, her kind eyes soft. "You remind me a lot of my late husband, Jonah. He believed in helping others, no matter how small the gesture." Jonah looked up at her, curious. Really? She nodded, smiling faintly. He always used to say that kindness is like planting seeds. Sometimes you don't see them grow right away, but they'll bloom when the time is right. Jonah's mind flashed back to Ethan in the cafeteria and the way his face had lit up, even just a little, when he'd shared his sandwich. Maybe Mrs. Finch was right. Maybe kindness really did grow in ways you couldn't always see. As Jonah handed the empty mug back to Mrs. Finch, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. Jonah took it and blinked in surprise. It was a tiny, silver bicycle bell. It looked brand new, the metal shining in the pale afternoon light. "I saw you eyeing that bike at the thrift store," Mrs. Finch said with a wink. "It's not much, but when you get it, you'll have a bell ready to go." Jonah's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," he said softly, his voice catching. She patted his shoulder gently. "Keep working hard, Jonah. You'll get there." Jonah walked home that evening with the bell tucked carefully in his pocket. It was small, but it felt like more than just a bell. It felt like encouragement, like a promise that he was moving closer to his goal. That night, Jonah sat at his desk with the glass jar in front of him. He added the $5 he had earned from Mrs. Lee and the few coins he had left in his pocket. The jar was heavier now, though still not full. Beside it, he placed the small silver bell. He held it in his hand for a moment, running his thumb over the cool metal. His mother knocked gently on the door frame before stepping inside. "How's the saving coming along?" "Slow," Jonah admitted, "but I'll get there." Sarah sat down on the edge of the bed, watching him carefully. "You know, Jonah," she said softly, "what you've been doing helping people like Mrs. Finch and Mrs. Lee, sharing your lunch with that boy at school, it means something. It's not just about the money." Jonah looked up at her, surprised. "I know, but I still want to earn the bike." His mother smiled. "And you will, but I hope you know that the kindness you've shown is worth more than any bike could ever be." Jonah glanced back at the glass jar and the bell sitting next to it. He thought of Ethan's quiet, "Thank you," Mrs. Lee's rare soft words, and Mrs. Finch's gift. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe the things he was learning were worth more than the bike itself. Still, Jonah smiled to himself as he tucked the bell into the jar, resting it on top of the growing collection of coins and bills. He would get there, one step at a time. As he lay in bed that night, listening to Noah's soft breathing, Jonah felt a new sense of purpose. He didn't just want the bike anymore. He wanted to keep planting seeds, just like Mrs. Finch's husband had said, and see what might bloom. And deep down, Jonah knew the best was yet to come. The days grew colder as November settled in. Frost edged the windows each morning, and Jonah could see his breath in the air when he left for school. The leaves were almost gone now, leaving behind bare, twisting branches that clawed at the gray sky. The wind was sharper too, cutting through his thin jacket as he pushed his scooter toward Mrs. Lee's house one Saturday morning. The bell Mrs. Finch had given him was tucked safely in the jar back home. Jonah had grown used to glancing at the jar every night. It was getting heavier, and his dream of owning the bike finally felt real, even if he still had a ways to go. But the Parker household, like the neighborhood itself, was built on thin margins, and those margins could disappear in an instant. That morning, Jonah's father, Marcus, sat at the kitchen table, staring down at his coffee. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the side of the mug, a nervous habit Jonah had seen only a few times. Jonah's mother, Sarah, stood by the stove, her back to both of them, as she flipped pancakes. Her shoulders looked stiff. "Jonah, come sit," Marcus said quietly. Jonah sat down slowly, unsure of what was happening. Noah, still in his pajamas, played with his cereal at the other end of the table, oblivious to the strange tension in the room. "Work's cutting back again," Marcus said after a moment, his voice low and careful. He glanced at Sarah before looking back at Jonah. Fewer hours at the factory this month. Maybe next month too. Jonah's stomach sank. He knew what that meant. Less money for groceries, for bills, less money for everything. Sarah turned around with 2 plates, setting one in front of Marcus and another in front of Jonah. "We'll be fine," she said quickly, though her voice wavered slightly. "We always figure it out." Marcus nodded, his face heavy with worry. "Yeah, we'll be fine." But Jonah heard what his father wasn't saying. He'd seen that look before, the one that meant Marcus would work whatever odd shifts he could find to make up for the shortfall, no matter how exhausted he became. Jonah picked at his pancake, the meal that suddenly tasted a little less warm. For the first time in weeks, he looked at the glass jar on his desk and wondered if maybe he shouldn't keep saving for the bike. Maybe the money could be better used somewhere else. That afternoon, Jonah bundled up in his jacket and scarf, pulling the thin fabric tighter around himself as he walked to Mrs. Lee's house. The cold was bitter, slicing through his clothes and making his fingers ache. Mrs. Lee's lawn was covered in frost-dampened leaves, brown and brittle underfoot. Jonah set to work immediately, trying to ignore the way his hands stung as he gripped the wooden rake. About halfway through the yard, Jonah heard the front door creak open behind him. "Jonah!" Mrs. Lee called, her voice sharper than usual. He stopped and turned, brushing his hair out of his face. Mrs. Lee stood on the porch, wrapped tightly in a thick shawl. Her face was hard to read, as it always was, but there was something softer in her voice this time. "Why are you out here without gloves? You'll freeze your hands off," she said, frowning. Jonah shrugged, his breath misting in the air. "It's fine. I'm okay." Mrs. Lee disappeared inside without another word, leaving Jonah puzzled. He thought she had gone back to her sewing or her crossword puzzles, but a few minutes later, the door opened again. "Here," she said briskly, holding something out toward him. Jonah climbed the porch steps and blinked at what she held, a pair of thick, knitted gloves. They were gray and a little worn, but looked far warmer than the ones Jonah didn't have. "I can't," Jonah started, but Mrs. Lee cut him off. "Don't argue," she said firmly. "I don't use them anymore. Take them." Jonah hesitated before reaching out and slipping them on. They were warm, impossibly warm, and fit almost perfectly. He flexed his fingers, surprised by how good they felt. "Thank you, Mrs. Lee." Mrs. Lee nodded sharply and went back inside without another word. Jonah stood on the porch for a moment, staring at his gloved hands. He hadn't expected kindness from Mrs. Lee. She wasn't the sort to fuss over anyone, least of all a kid like him. As he finished raking the yard, Jonah thought about the gloves. They weren't just gloving, they were something else, something more. Jonah had spent so much time helping others that he had forgotten what it felt like to be on the receiving end of someone else's care. When Jonah got home, his father was sitting on the couch with his toolbox open, a frown etched deep into his face. The heater had stopped working again. Jonah sat down beside him, watching as Marcus tinkered with the wires and fuses. "I can help," Jonah offered softly. His father glanced at him and smiled faintly. "Thanks, kiddo, but I've got this one." Jonah pulled off his gloves, holding them in his lap. "Mrs. Lee gave me these today, said I shouldn't rake without gloves." Marcus looked over, raising an eyebrow. "Mrs. Lee did?" Jonah nodded. "Yeah, I didn't think she'd care, but she does. I think she just hides it." Marcus let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "People surprise you sometimes, don't they?" Jonah smiled a little. "Yeah, I guess they do." His father paused, setting the screwdriver down and looking at Jonah thoughtfully. "You've been doing a lot of helping lately, Jonah. Your mom and I see that. Don't think we don't notice." Jonah shrugged, looking down at his gloved hands. I don't know. I want to help." Marcus reached out and squeezed Jonah's shoulder. "You've got a good heart, son. Don't let the world change that." Jonah nodded, his throat tight. He didn't know how to explain it, but his father's words stayed with him long after they had managed to get the heater running again. The next morning, Jonah's mother sat at the kitchen table, going over a stack of bills with a tired expression. Jonah hesitated in the doorway, his small jar of savings flashing in his mind. He thought about the bike, still waiting for him in Mr. Willis's shop window, and about the way his father's shoulders sagged a little more each day. He stepped forward. "Mom?" Sarah looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Yes, sweetheart?" Jonah took a deep breath. "If you need it, you can use the money I've been saving." His mother's face softened, her eyes shining with a mix of love and sadness. She stood, walking over to kneel in front of him so they were eye to eye. "Jonah, no, that's your money. You've worked hard for it." Jonah shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, but you and Dad are working hard too." She smiled, cupping his face gently in her hands. "We'll figure it out, Jonah. That money is for your dream. Don't give up on it just because things get hard, okay?" Jonah nodded reluctantly, though his heart still felt heavy. That afternoon, Jonah stopped by Mr. Willis's thrift store, the glass jar weighing down his backpack. The bell on the door jingled as he entered, and Mr. Willis looked up from the counter with a smile. "Back again, Jonah?" "Yeah," Jonah said quietly, walking over to the bike. It was still there, sitting proudly in the window like it was waiting for him. Mr. Willis joined him, leaning on the handlebars. "How's the saving coming along?" Jonah smiled faintly. "It's slow, but I'm getting there." Mr. Willis nodded thoughtfully, studying Jonah. "You know, Jonah, sometimes you have to trust that hard times don't last forever. You just keep working, keep believing. Good things have a way of finding their way back to good people." Jonah thought of Mrs. Lee's gloves, Mrs. Finch's cookies, and his parents' quiet perseverance. Mr. Willis was right. Hard times didn't last forever. Jonah smiled up at him. "I think you're right, Mr. Willis." And as he looked at the bike one last time before leaving the shop, Jonah felt something stir inside him, a small, steady belief that he would make it through this, just like his family always did. The days grew shorter as November stretched toward Thanksgiving. The chill in the air had sharpened, and the first hints of snow clung to the ground in delicate patches. Jonah Parker noticed everything around him seemed quieter now. Houses dark a little earlier, neighbors rushing indoors to escape the cold, and his father's footsteps sounding heavier when he came home from the factory. The heater in their small house worked on and off, and Jonah often caught his mother rubbing her hands together at the kitchen table to keep warm. She never said much about it, but Jonah could tell that this season had settled like a weight over his parents' shoulders. The factory cutting back hours had thrown everything off balance, and Jonah could see the effort his father put into hiding his worry. Jonah, though, had his own resolve. He continued his small jobs, even as the cold made the work harder. When the lawns no longer needed mowing, he found other ways to earn, sweeping porches for neighbors, shoveling thin layers of frost-dusted snow, and offering to walk dogs who still needed their daily exercise. Each day, he added a little more to the jar on his desk, now half full with crumpled bills and coins. One Saturday morning, Jonah trudged down the street toward Mrs. Finch's house. She had called the evening before, asking him to clear the leaves from her back porch. Jonah was grateful for the work, though the cold made his fingers ache even through Mrs. Lee's knitted gloves. When he arrived, Mrs. Finch greeted him warmly, her apron dusted with flour as usual. "Good morning, Jonah. You're such a dependable young man," she said, smiling as she handed him a broom. "I'll have some cocoa ready for you when you're done." "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," Jonah said, smiling faintly as he stepped onto the porch. The work wasn't hard, but the icy wind blew across the yard, whipping stray leaves into swirls and biting at Jonah's cheeks. He worked carefully, sweeping the porch clean and gathering leaves into neat piles, determined to finish the job well. When he was done, Jonah knocked on the back door to let Mrs. Finch know. She opened it with a steaming mug of cocoa and a plate with 2 cookies, still warm. "Come inside for a minute and warm up," she said kindly, motioning him in. Jonah hesitated, but eventually stepped into the kitchen. The warmth hit him immediately, and the smell of cinnamon and sugar made his stomach growl. He sat at the table as Mrs. Finch busied herself near the oven. "You work so hard, Jonah," she said, her back to him as she pulled a pie from the oven. "It's rare to see someone your age so responsible." Jonah shrugged, feeling shy under the praise. "I just want to help." Mrs. Finch turned and studied him, her kind eyes twinkling. "Your parents must be proud of you." Jonah nodded. "I think they are." He paused, feeling the weight of his words. "It's been a little hard lately. My dad's hours got cut at the factory." Mrs. Finch's smile faltered slightly, and for a moment she seemed deep in thought. Then she sat down across from him. "You know, Jonah, life has a way of testing us sometimes, but it also has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. You just keep doing what you're doing. Things will turn around, you'll see." Jonah sipped his cocoa, letting the warmth spread through him. "I hope so," he said quietly. That afternoon, as Jonah walked home, he spotted Ethan, the boy he had shared his lunch with a couple of weeks earlier, standing outside his house with his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. Ethan looked up as Jonah passed, offering a small wave. "Hey, Jonah!" Jonah stopped and smiled faintly. "Hey, Ethan, what's up?" Ethan shifted his weight awkwardly, glancing at the ground. I wanted to say thanks again for the sandwich that day." Jonah shrugged. "It was no big deal." "It was to me," Ethan said, looking up at him. "My mom was sick that week, and things were just hard." He paused, pulling something small out of his pocket. "Here, I wanted to give you this." Jonah frowned, glancing down as Ethan held out a small, round keychain with a bicycle engraved on it. It was old, the edges scratched, but the details were still clear. "I found it in my brother's stuff," Ethan said. "He doesn't need it anymore, so I thought you might like it. You've been saving up for a bike, right?" Jonah took the keychain, his heart tightening. "Yeah, I have." Ethan smiled a little. "Well, now you've got something for it when you get it." Jonah looked down at the keychain, running his thumb over the smooth metal. It was small, but like Mrs. Finch's bell, it felt like encouragement, like a piece of his dream coming together, bit by bit. "Thanks, Ethan," Jonah said softly. "Any time," Ethan replied, before shoving his hands back in his pockets and heading inside. Jonah stared at the keychain for another moment before carefully tucking it into his pocket. That evening, Jonah sat at the dinner table with his family, the smell of his mother's vegetable stew filling the small kitchen. His father looked tired, but there was something gentler about his face tonight, as though the weight he carried had lightened just a little. "Good news today," Marcus said after a while, glancing at Sarah. "The factory called. They're offering me a shift next week to make up for the hours they cut." Sarah let out a quiet breath of relief, her shoulders relaxing. "That's wonderful, Marcus." Jonah smiled faintly, the small flicker of hope in his father's voice filling him with warmth. "And you, Jonah," Marcus said, turning to him. "You've been working hard. We see it, you know. All those little jobs you're doing, they're helping more than you realize." Jonah looked down at his bowl, his cheeks flushing. "I just want to do my part." Marcus smiled proudly, reaching over to ruffle Jonah's hair. "You're a good kid. Keep at it, and you'll go far in life." Jonah nodded, the weight in his chest easing slightly. Later that night, Jonah sat at his desk, his jar of savings in front of him. The small silver bell Mrs. Finch had given him and the keychain Ethan had gifted him sat next to the jar. Jonah picked up the keychain, running his fingers over the engraved bicycle again. It wasn't much, but it meant something. It reminded him that people noticed the good you did, even when you didn't expect them to. He thought about what Mrs. Finch had said, that life sometimes surprised you. Jonah wasn't sure what those surprises would look like, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. He glanced out the window, the night sky clear and full of stars. A smile tugged at his lips as he whispered softly to himself, "I'll get there." And deep down, Jonah knew he would. The first real snow of the season arrived early in December. It started as a light dusting, soft and harmless, but by evening the snow fell heavier, swirling in thick curtains across the Parker family's small neighborhood. Jonah sat at his bedroom window, watching the flakes gather on the empty street below, the glow of the street lamp turning everything a muted gold. The heater rattled softly in the corner, struggling against the cold. Jonah knew his father had fixed it a few weeks ago, but it always seemed to sound worse when the temperatures dropped. He pulled his knitted gloves, Mrs. Lee's gloves, on and sat at his desk, looking at the jar of coins and bills he had been working so hard to fill. The glass jar had weight now, but Jonah knew he was still short of the bike's cost. Despite how far he had come, the thought tugged at him. Would he ever get there? The next morning, Jonah woke to a neighborhood blanketed in white. The snow lay thick and untouched, softening the sharp edges of rooftops and driveways. It was beautiful, but Jonah's first thought was practical. Shoveling. He quickly pulled on his coat, scarf, and gloves, ignoring the icy bite of the air as he stepped outside. The snow was deeper than he had expected. Jonah's boots sank into it with every step, but he pushed forward, shovel in hand, determined to clear the walkway for his parents. "Jonah, come back inside," his mother called from the front door, her voice tight with worry. "It's freezing out here." "I'll just clear the path really quick," Jonah called back, already digging the shovel into the snow. The work was slow. His arms ached as he scooped and lifted the heavy piles of snow, pushing them aside. He was halfway through the driveway when he saw Mrs. Lee's house a few doors down. Her porch steps were buried, the snow piled up like a white wall against her door. Jonah stopped for a moment, looking back at his own house. The thought of warmth, the heater's hum, his mother's hands wrapping him in a blanket called to him, but he pushed it aside. He made his way down the street, the cold air stinging his face as he trudged through the snow. Mrs. Lee's house felt a world away, but when he finally arrived, Jonah didn't hesitate. He planted his feet and began shoveling, clearing one step at a time. The work was even harder now. The snow was heavier, the cold sharper, but Jonah kept going, his breath misting in front of him. By the time he had finished, sweat had gathered under his coat, even in the freezing air. He leaned on his shovel, catching his breath, just as the door creaked open. Mrs. Lee appeared, wrapped in her heavy shawl, her face lined with both age and surprise. "Jonah Parker," she said, her voice sharp but softened at the edges. "What in the world are you doing out here?" "Clearing your steps," Jonah said simply, straightening up. Mrs. Lee stared at him for a moment before her lips thinned into something almost like a smile. "And who asked you to do that?" Jonah shrugged, brushing snow off his gloves. "No one. I just figured you'd need a way out." Mrs. Lee said nothing for a long moment, her sharp gaze searching his face. "You'll freeze out here," she finally said. "Come inside and warm up." Jonah hesitated. "I should—" "Inside," Mrs. Lee repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Inside, Mrs. Lee's house was warmer than Jonah had expected. The air smelled faintly of soup, and a small fire crackled in the corner. Mrs. Lee shuffled into the kitchen and returned with a mug of hot tea, placing it in front of Jonah as he sat awkwardly on the edge of her couch. "Drink that," she said, settling into her armchair with a sigh. "Thank you," Jonah said softly, wrapping his hands around the mug. The tea was strong and a little bitter, but the heat spread through him, loosening the cold from his bones. Mrs. Lee watched him carefully, her sharp gaze never wavering. "You didn't have to do that, you know," she said after a moment. Jonah looked up. "I know, but I wanted to." Mrs. Lee huffed quietly, though Jonah thought she looked almost pleased. "You're a strange boy," she said. "Most kids your age wouldn't give me the time of day." Jonah smiled faintly, sipping his tea. "Most kids don't know you as well as I do." For the first time, Mrs. Lee laughed a dry, raspy sound that made Jonah's heart lift a little. "Fair enough," she said, shaking her head. "You're too much like your father, stubborn and kind. That's a dangerous combination." Jonah smiled again, but said nothing. Before he left, Mrs. Lee pressed a small envelope into his hand. "For the work you did today," she said briskly, ignoring his protests. "Don't argue." Jonah nodded reluctantly, tucking the envelope into his coat pocket. "Thank you, Mrs. Lee." "Go on home," she said, waving him off, "and don't freeze your ears off on the way." When Jonah returned home, his mother fussed over him, pulling his wet coat off and wrapping him in a thick blanket. "I told you it was too cold to be out there," she scolded, but her voice was full of relief. Jonah smiled up at her. "I'm fine, Mom." Later, in his room, Jonah sat at his desk and opened the envelope Mrs. Lee had given him. Inside was a crisp $10 bill. Jonah stared at it for a moment, running his fingers over the edges. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to tip the balance in his savings. He opened the jar, carefully adding the bill to the pile of crumpled ones. It wasn't quite full, but Jonah knew that he finally had enough. He smiled softly to himself as he picked up the small bicycle bell Mrs. Finch had given him and the keychain Ethan had shared. Both sat proudly on his desk, reminders of all the kindnesses that had brought him here. The next day, Jonah walked into Mr. Willis's thrift store with a mix of nervousness and excitement twisting in his stomach. The old man looked up from behind the counter, his thick glasses sliding down his nose. "Well, well," Mr. Willis said with a grin. "You're back, Jonah." Jonah nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think I'm ready." Mr. Willis's eyes crinkled with warmth as Jonah set the jar on the counter. Together, they counted the bills and coins, the clink of quarters, and the rustle of paper filling the small shop. When they finished, Mr. Willis leaned back and smiled. "Looks like you did it, Jonah. That bike's yours." Jonah's heart leapt. "Really?" "Really," Mr. Willis said, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "You earned it." The old man wheeled the bike out from its spot by the window, the sunlight catching on its scratched frame and worn tires. Jonah ran his hand over the handlebars, feeling the cool metal under his fingers. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. Mr. Willis handed him a small receipt and winked. "Now, you ride it like it's brand new, you hear?" Jonah grinned, his heart full to bursting. "I will. Thank you, Mr. Willis." As Jonah wheeled the bike home, the wind whipping past him, he felt lighter than he had in months. The bike was more than just something he wanted. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for, of every person who had shown him kindness along the way. And as he rode down the quiet, snow-dusted street, Jonah knew that kindness, like a storm, could reshape everything in its path. The morning after Jonah brought home his new bike, the air was bright and crisp, the kind of winter morning that made everything sparkle under the sun. The snow still lay thick on the ground, but the roads had been plowed, leaving the neighborhood with a clean, fresh look. Jonah woke early, still buzzing with excitement from the day before. The bike sat proudly in the corner of the living room, its scratched frame almost glowing in the soft light filtering through the window. Jonah couldn't stop looking at it. It was his. He had earned it. At breakfast, his father chuckled as he caught Jonah sneaking glances at the bike between bites of toast. "You're going to wear a hole in the floor with all that staring," Marcus teased, a rare lightness in his voice. Jonah grinned, his face flushing. "I'm just excited, Dad." Sarah smiled as she poured more coffee into Marcus's cup. "You should be proud, Jonah. That bike is more than just something you bought, it's something you worked for." Jonah nodded. He didn't need to say much. His heart felt full enough to carry the words for him. After lunch, the knock came. It wasn't loud or hurried, but it was unexpected enough to make Jonah's father pause mid-conversation. "Who could that be?" Marcus muttered, as he stood and made his way to the door. Jonah, sitting at the kitchen table, craned his neck as his father opened it. Standing on the porch was a man in a familiar dark coat and leather briefcase. It took Jonah only a second to recognize him, Daniel Whitaker. But Daniel wasn't alone. Beside him, holding a small blanketed bundle, stood a woman with dark hair. Her face was softer than Jonah remembered, and her eyes, though still tired, were filled with something brighter than they'd been at the bus stop that day. Jonah's mother gasped softly from behind him. "Who is that?" Marcus stepped aside, his face a mix of confusion and curiosity. Come in," he said quickly, holding the door open. Daniel smiled warmly as he stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. The woman followed, clutching the small bundle in her arms as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Her dark hair framed her face, and when her eyes landed on Jonah, they lit up with recognition. "You must be Jonah Parker," she said softly. Jonah nodded slowly, his heart starting to pound. "Yes, ma'am." She stepped forward, and Jonah noticed how carefully she held the bundle, how protectively her hands curled around it. "I'm Emily Bennett," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We met a few weeks ago at the bus stop." Jonah's eyes widened. "I remember." Emily smiled, though her eyes were misty. "I've thought about you every day since then. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't helped me that afternoon." Jonah didn't know what to say. He could only stare at her, his chest tight, as she shifted the blanket slightly. "This," she continued, her voice soft, "is Grace. She was born 2 weeks ago. Healthy, happy, and safe because of you." Jonah's throat tightened as he looked down at the tiny baby cradled in Emily's arms. Grace's face peeked out from the soft yellow blanket, her eyes barely open, her little mouth moving in her sleep. Jonah couldn't explain it, but the sight of her so small, so perfect, made his heart feel impossibly full. "Because of me?" he whispered. Emily nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "That day at the bus stop I was at my lowest. I had nothing. No money, no hope, just the weight of the world on my shoulders. And then you came along. You gave me your last few dollars, Jonah, and you didn't even hesitate. That small kindness was everything to me." Jonah glanced at his parents, who were watching the moment unfold with tears in their eyes. His father's hand rested firmly on his mother's shoulder, as though anchoring her in place. "I was able to get home that day," Emily continued. "My family helped me get back on my feet. I found a place to stay, and now I'm starting over. But I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for you. And Grace." She looked down at the baby, her voice trembling. "Grace wouldn't be here either." Jonah couldn't speak. The lump in his throat made it impossible. He felt as though the room had shrunk, as though all the warmth in the world had gathered right here in this moment. Daniel stepped forward then, his steady presence filling the room. "Emily wanted to come thank you in person, Jonah, and while she knows you didn't help her expecting anything in return, she couldn't come empty-handed." Emily reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, carefully wrapped package. "This is for you," she said, holding it out to Jonah. Jonah stared at the gift, unsure of what to do. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," Emily said firmly. "Please." Jonah took the package carefully, his hands trembling. He sat back down at the kitchen table as his parents watched. Slowly, he unwrapped it, peeling back the paper to reveal a notebook. Its cover was simple, a deep blue, with the words "Dream Big" embossed in gold letters. Jonah ran his fingers over the words, his throat tight. "Dream big," he whispered to himself. Emily smiled through her tears. "I know it's not much, but I thought maybe you could use it to write down your dreams, your goals, because you gave me hope that day, Jonah, and I think you're going to do incredible things." Jonah looked up at her, his vision blurred. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice cracking. Emily nodded, wiping her cheeks with her sleeve. "No, Jonah, thank you." She leaned down slightly, holding Grace closer to him. "You'll always be a part of her story," she said softly. "I hope you know that." Jonah stared at the tiny baby, who stretched her hand under the blanket as though reaching for the world. He smiled, tears stinging his eyes. "She's perfect," he said quietly. Emily smiled, her face full of warmth. "She's here because someone believed in kindness when it mattered most." After Emily and Daniel left, the house fell quiet again. Jonah sat at the kitchen table with the notebook still in his hands, his fingers tracing the gold letters. His father sat down across from him, his voice soft. "Proud of you, son." Jonah smiled faintly. "I didn't do anything big." Marcus shook his head. "You don't have to do something big for it to matter, Jonah. The smallest acts can change lives. You've proved that." Sarah knelt beside Jonah, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You gave someone hope when they had none. That's a gift, Jonah. Never forget that." Jonah looked down at the notebook, his heart steady and full. He opened it to the first page and, with a quiet sense of purpose, wrote 3 simple words. "Be kind always." He smiled softly to himself as he closed the notebook. The bike he had worked for, the bell Mrs. Finch had given him, and now the notebook in his hands, they all felt connected, like pieces of a bigger story. And Jonah knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The days leading up to Christmas were busier than ever. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the neighborhood in soft white as Jonah Parker pedaled through the streets on his new bike. It wasn't flashy or shiny, but it was his, and it felt perfect. The small silver bell Mrs. Finch had given him jingled softly as he rode, and the bicycle keychain from Ethan swung lightly from the handlebars, like a reminder of all the kindness that had helped him get here. Jonah's parents had noticed the change in him. He still worked hard shoveling snow, walking dogs, helping neighbors, but it wasn't just about saving money anymore. There was a quiet purpose in everything Jonah did. Every small act of kindness seemed to fill him with something deeper than pride, something that made the cold days feel warmer. On Christmas Eve, Jonah's family gathered in their small living room, the warmth from the old heater pushing back against the winter chill. The room was modestly decorated. A small tree sat in the corner, its mismatched ornaments glowing faintly in the soft light. Sarah had sewn a few simple stockings that hung from the mantel, and a few wrapped gifts sat under the tree. The Parkers didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. As they settled in for the evening, a knock sounded at the door. Marcus glanced toward the window, frowning. Who would be out in this weather? "I'll get it," Jonah said quickly, standing up. When he opened the door, his breath caught in surprise. Standing there, bundled tightly in coats, scarves, and hats, were a group of neighbors, Mrs. Finch, Mr. Willis, Mrs. Lee, Ethan's mother, and even Mr. Harris, the older gentleman Jonah had once helped with groceries. They were smiling despite the cold, and Jonah could see that Ethan and a few other kids from school had come along too. "Jonah Parker," Mrs. Finch called, her voice cheerful. "Would you mind inviting us in?" Jonah blinked in surprise but stepped aside quickly. Of course. Come in." Sarah appeared in the doorway to the living room, her brow furrowed in confusion. "What's all this?" Mrs. Finch smiled warmly as she set down a large tin. "It's Christmas Eve, Sarah, and we've all come to share a little something with you and your family." One by one, the neighbors placed small bundles on the coffee table, baskets of cookies, loaves of bread, bags of fresh fruit, and even a jar of homemade jam. Mr. Willis brought a small wrapped box, which he handed to Marcus. "It's nothing fancy," he said with a grin. "Just a little something to say thank you for raising a good boy." Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears as she looked at the gathering of neighbors filling their small living room. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice thick. Mrs. Lee cleared her throat, her sharp tones softened. "Because of Jonah." She turned to him, her eyes kind despite their usual sternness. "This boy of yours has spent months helping all of us, raking leaves, shoveling snow, sharing his lunch, and doing it all without asking for anything in return. That kind of kindness doesn't go unnoticed." Ethan's mother nodded. "Jonah helped my son when he didn't have enough to eat. I didn't forget that. And he shoveled my porch without being asked," Mrs. Lee added quickly. Jonah felt his cheeks warm as he glanced at his parents, who were watching him with expressions of love and quiet pride. He hadn't thought much of what he had done. It had all felt small, just little things he could do to help. But as he looked around the room, at the faces of people who had noticed, it struck him how far those small acts had traveled. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice low and steady. "Thank you," he said simply, looking at the group of neighbors. "Thank you for being here." Mrs. Finch smiled softly. "No, Marcus. Thank you. You've raised a boy who reminds us all what kindness looks like." Jonah's mother reached over and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a tight hug. "We're so proud of you, Jonah," she whispered. After the neighbors left, the house felt brighter somehow. The simple baskets of food and the warm words spoken that evening lingered like a glow, filling every corner. Jonah sat on the couch, holding the notebook Emily had given him, the words "Dream Big" catching the light of the tree. His father sat down beside him, his rough hand resting on Jonah's shoulder. "You've done something special, Jonah. I hope you know that." Jonah nodded, his heart full. "I didn't really think about it like that. I just wanted to help." Marcus smiled, his expression softening. "That's what makes it matter even more." Jonah looked at the notebook, flipping to the first page where he had written, "Be kind always." Those words weren't just something to say, they were a promise, a way of living. Jonah realized now that kindness wasn't just about big gestures. It was in the little moments, the small choices that could ripple outward and change everything. Years later, when Jonah stood at the podium on his high school graduation day, he held the same notebook in his hands. The crowd in the auditorium was full of families cheering for their children, but Jonah's eyes sought out a few familiar faces: Mrs. Finch, Mr. Willis, Mrs. Lee, Ethan, and even Emily Bennett, holding a young Grace on her lap. Jonah took a steadying breath, looking out at the audience. "When I was 12 years old," he began, "I learned that kindness is like a ripple in a pond. It starts small, sometimes as small as a sandwich, a shovel in the snow, or a few dollars given to a stranger at a bus stop." The room grew silent as Jonah continued. "What I didn't know then was that those small acts could travel farther than I could see. I didn't know they could come back, bringing people together and reminding us all that even when the world feels cold, kindness is still there, waiting for someone to choose it." He paused, his voice softening. "Kindness changes people. It changed me, and it taught me that no matter how small you feel, what you do matters." Jonah closed the notebook and looked out at the crowd one last time. "So, if there's one thing I hope you remember today, it's this: be kind always. It makes more of a difference than you'll ever know." The room erupted into applause as Jonah stepped back from the podium, his heart swelling with gratitude. That afternoon, as Jonah walked through his small neighborhood, Grace, now a lively little girl, ran up beside him, clutching his hand with her small fingers. "Jonah?" she asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Is it true you gave my mama your last money?" Jonah smiled down at her. "It's true." "Why did you do that?" Grace asked, her voice innocent. Jonah thought about it for a moment before answering. "Because it was the right thing to do." Grace nodded seriously, as though she understood. "I want to be kind too," she said. Jonah grinned and squeezed her hand gently. "You will be, Grace. You already are." As they walked down the quiet street, the snow beginning to fall softly around them, Jonah looked up at the sky, feeling the same quiet sense of hope he had felt all those years ago. Kindness, he knew now, was not just something you gave, it was something you carried with you. And as long as you chose it, it would always find a way to change the world. Jonah's story reminds us that even the smallest act of kindness can have far-reaching effects, touching lives in ways we may never expect. It starts with one choice, one moment of compassion, and that kindness grows, changing us, the people around us, and the world. Through hard work, quiet resilience, and an open heart, Jonah became a reminder that kindness can be both simple and extraordinary. His journey shows that no matter who we are, we all have the power to make a difference. If you enjoyed Jonah's story and believe in the power of kindness to inspire and change lives, we invite you to join our growing community. Subscribe to our channel to hear more heartfelt stories like this one. Stories of hope, perseverance, and the small acts that lead to extraordinary outcomes. Your support helps us share these messages and spread a little lighter in the world. Subscribe now, and remember, be kind always. You never know whose life you'll change. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.